So today's lesson is going to be looking at the key features of change theories, and they are conflict, evolutionary, functionalist, and interactionist. So social theories are a way of understanding and looking at human behaviour, as well as knowing about continuity and change, or seeing continuity and change. So social theories are theories, so they do have weaknesses and are subject to criticism, but they're also really good and useful for understanding the causes of change. So it's really important to understand and know agents of change. So I'm going to give you an acronym, and so remember it as STEEP. And so the first letter is socioeconomic processes, and I'm going to give you some examples that relate to Afghanistan. So this could be the socioeconomic status of women, or urbanisation, or the movement of people. The next one is technological processes, and examples of this is like cyber terrorism and internet access. So how cyber terrorism can cause change, or how just purely having access to the internet can cause change. After that is economic processes, and e-commerce is an example of this. So e-commerce is like being able to buy things online and using debit cards and using online banking systems. There's also environmental processes, and for Afghanistan, what that means is the scarcity of resources. So how like lack of infrastructure or a lack of availability of internet or technology, or even just electricity can lead to change. And then lastly is political processes. And so for Afghanistan, becoming a democracy is a political process that leads to change. Okay, so now we're going to look at the four theories in depth. So the first one is conflict theory, and Karl Marx is kind of seen to be the creator of it. So he's the guy that was also seen to create communism. And basically what this theory looks at or focuses on is how power, or those groups that have power, will use their resources to maintain their power. As through the theory, it is believed that these groups that have power only really care about their needs, and therefore will ensure to maintain their needs, which comes from that power. And so it believes that it explains change through the process of conflict, as those who are marginalised or don't have power will kind of rise up against the power structures together to cause change. So really, conflict theory is really good to explain like revolutions, feminism, racial tensions, so the civil rights movements, and even Black Lives Matter now, because they're all got to do with issues of power or power inequalities and kind of a resistance or conflict that leads to that change. And they believe that, or explain continuity through those who are oppressed, will essentially work to help those in power, and by working to help those in power or to support those in power, they're conforming to their own social status and therefore maintaining continuity. So this theory really focuses on the macro level of change. It doesn't really explain micro or even meso change to some extent. It mostly focuses on macro changes. Therefore, mostly because there's also conflict, changes seem to be mostly rapid. However, it is believed that even with rapid macro change, there is a build-up of slow change over time. However, it doesn't really focus on that slow build-up of change. It recognises that there's a slow build-up of change, but it doesn't really explain it. So it believes that change is mostly rapid, but over time there is gradual change. And as again, like I said, it only focuses on big change, and therefore it sees change as being transformative. So it's permanent, it can't go back. Weaknesses of this theory is that it doesn't explain gradual change. So like I said, it recognises gradual change, but it doesn't really explain it. It also it can't explain change brought on by power groups. So as we come to see when we look at Afghanistan, is that there's significant change that is occurring in Afghanistan that has been introduced by groups in power, like the government, and conflict theory can't really explain this. It also really struggles to explain minimal or micro changes. Okay, so now we're going to look at evolutionary theory. And evolutionary theory is very similar to evolutionary change, which is what we've already looked at in chapter 1A. So essentially this theory is that it believes that all societies will develop over time and therefore become more modern. And this theory kind of argues that all societies will become more Western or more modern through this development over time. So, yeah, it sees change to be either Western change or modern change, or at least on the process of Westernisation or modernisation. So, therefore, it sees all change to be progress. And what that means is that it doesn't recognise or can't explain change that goes backwards, because it believes that all change is permanent and it's transformative in a way. So it's definitely just focuses on the macro level of change. It doesn't really look at micro or meso levels of changes. So the best way to understand this theory is to look at like the progression of societies over time. And most societies have started with the hunter-gatherer phase. Then it's believed that it will go to agricultural, and that the change will see kind of farms and things like that emerge. And then it believes it then progresses to industrial. And, some societies are currently in that phase now. So Afghanistan is definitely in an industrial kind of change. And then there's post-industrial. And that's post-industrial is kind of like Western societies. So definitely sees change to be progressive, and societies are seen to becoming more complex over time, like evolutionary change. There are definite strengths and weaknesses to this theory as well. So one of the clear weaknesses is that assumption that all change is progressive. Evolutionary theory struggles to explain change where it's kind of reverting back to what the society used to be. So an example of this would be, say, if Australia restricted its borders significantly to kind of mirror what we had during the White Australia policy, that would be seen to be regressive change. And it would struggle to understand. It also assumes that all societies follow the same path, which is also a very clear weakness. So that outline that I gave before of hunter-gatherer to agricultural to industrial to post-industrial, evolutionary theory believes that all societies will go in that kind of path. So it almost believes like it's a step. You need to step on one step to get to the next one, which is not necessarily the case for all societies. And then the last thing is that it does not really explain why change is occurring. It more just describes what the change is, so struggles to explain why it's occurring. However, there are some clear strengths to this theory. So it just, like I said, it describes change quite well. And this is because it focuses on what the change is, not how it's coming about. It also shows the processes of modernisation. So again, it doesn't explain why societies are modernising, but it explains that process of modernisation, as well as linear or evolutionary change. So the next theory we're going to look at is functionalist theory, and this is a pretty interesting one. So what this theory focuses on is how social structures meet social needs. So I want you to think about this theory as like a man or a human, and within the human is all the institutions in society that will kind of exist in any society. And what this theory believes is that all of society is designed to support each other. Each of these institutions are working together for the betterment of society and to support each other. So essentially what this means is that it believes society is held together by solidarity and agreement. So each institution kind of negotiates with each other to decide and figure out what is required. So an example of this could be, families are breaking down a little bit and they're not teaching kids about, moral ethics and about appropriate behaviour in society. And so schools are seen to be kind of taking up that role now. It also believes that social change comes about through agreement. The other thing is that it believes that stability is maintained through support and collaboration. So this theory really focuses on the maintaining of society and the order and functionality of society. It's definitely in stark contrast with conflict theory, as it believes that change is not brought on by conflict but through negotiation. So some clear strengths of this theory is that it explains continuity reasonably well, and slow institutional changes it explains quite well as well. That's because, this theory really does focus on continuity more than change, and it explains continuity through kind of the continuation of practices based on the desires or the needs of the society. And so until the needs of society changes, society won't change. However, there are some clear weaknesses, as with any theory, and with this theory, it only really explains social or meso-macro changes, not micro or cultural changes. So it doesn't really it can't really understand or explain how cultural changes or cultural perceptions or attitudes can lead to change. It again only focuses on that social change, and it doesn't have any explanation for micro changes or micro influences to changes. It also struggles to acknowledge or doesn't acknowledge the work of the individual or the power of the individual. So again, because it doesn't focus on that micro level changes, it doesn't really see what role an individual has. It only focuses on the social structure and how that leads to change. Okay, so the last theory we're going to look at today is interactionist theory. Arguably, this is probably one of the more difficult theories to really understand, and that's because this change that it focuses on, it's more subtle, and that's because it mostly focuses on the relationships of individuals within their society and how the changing nature of relationships and the new relationships that are established and built can either lead to continuity or change. So essentially what this theory kind of is focused on or believes is how individuals act according to their interpretations of their world. And essentially it says or explains that interactions create meaning and how we make sense of our world. So it creates, through those interactions, we kind of get a better understanding of our world and our place in it. So essentially what it means is that when we interact with other individuals and our world, we create meaning from it. And that leads to continuity or change. So I'm going to give you an example. If you have a perception of, say, migrants based on your interactions with the media and other individuals, and this is therefore perpetuated because you all have similar perspectives, this obviously leads to continuity. However, this theory explains micro change through, say, when you meet a migrant and your perceptions are challenged because, how they are and how they interact is not being, completely aligned with what the media has represented. That will therefore change your perceptions based on those interactions, and therefore, through the interaction, your perspective or ideas are maintained or changed. So the strengths of this theory is that it explains, this is probably the only theory that explains micro or cultural changes, as it deals with the perceptions of individuals based on their interactions rather than social changes. It also explains gradual micro changes really well. So again, this is the only theory that really explains those gradual micro changes. Again, though, there's always weaknesses. And in this theory, the weaknesses really is that it neglects social change and its contributions. So this theory, because it's so focused on the micro level, struggles to really understand the role of society or social changes that lead to micro changes or different changing in perceptions, cultural perceptions. It also struggles to explain rapid macro changes or trickle down changes.